Dr. Amy Edmondson, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I've been doing this show for about 7.5 years, and we talk a lot about what makes great teams. We talk to great coaches, everything that has to do with relationship building and what makes great teams. And what's so funny is time after time, your name keeps coming up. You got to reach out to Amy. Amy's kind of the first that's pioneered some of this stuff. So I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about some of these concepts that are so important, including psychological safety and failure, and ultimately how to be a better coach. So, in short, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So, I want to dive into psychological safety first. There are probably a lot of nuances and different areas that we could go. But I think what I first want to do is set the table by asking you, what does psychological safety really look like inside of a high performing team? What does it really look
Yeah,
like?
it's a great question, believe it or not. It really looks like disagreement and energy and debate and vulnerability. So psychological safety describes an environment where you believe it's safe or welcome to speak up, right? To offer your point of view, to admit a mistake, to ask for help, to offer a dissenting view. Not that you think any of those things are super easy or fun, they generally are not, but that you believe they're how we work around here. That they're expected, they're welcome, it's how we roll.
What do coaches or leaders perhaps get wrong about psychological safety?
Yeah.
What are some
Yeah.
misconceptions out there that you'd love to crush?
You bet. Well, these misconceptions are out there and they're understandable. The first one, I think the most important one, is that psychological safety is about being nice and about being comfortable. And I understand the terminology suggests that, and it's wrong because learning is uncomfortable. Stretching is uncomfortable, to use a metaphor. And so psychological safety really describes a container where we know we can do those uncomfortable things. So, and coaches and managers around the world understandably are reluctant to lean into the idea that everybody has to be comfortable all the time. That just won't work, right? That won't work for ambition, that won't work for learning, for growth. So that's the most important misconception. I mean,
Are there
there
any?
there there are others,
Yeah,
but
let's hit a couple other ones. So the first one is
okay.
be nice and kind. They think it's all warm and fuzzy. What's another one that people kind of get wrong about psychological safety?
This one's sort of funny, but I keep hearing reports of it from the field that psychological safety means you'll get your way, or that, when you speak up and offer dissenting point of view, suddenly the world will go your way, not the other way. And psychological safety is indeed permission to share that view, but it's not a guarantee that your view will prevail. Right? It's a guarantee of genuine debate, honesty, candor, but it's not a guarantee of, you know, people agreeing with you.
What's the hardest part about psychological safety and creating a psychological safe environment? What's the hardest part?
I think the hardest part is accepting reality. We have to accept that our reality, I think in sports, but in any field, is that we live in an uncertain, complex, interdependent world. And so things won't, number one, things will go wrong, right? So just accept it. And when you realize that's when you really sort of internalize that that's the world we're living and working in, then psychological safety becomes more sensible because then you realize, yes, anyone's voice could matter. Anyone's voice could make a critical difference at an unexpected time. Someone lower, higher, right? Anyone could say something that might matter. That doesn't mean, of course, that anything you say will matter, but it means that anyone can say something that might matter. And so, I think once we start to truly believe that we are dealing with complexity, uncertainty, challenge ahead, then we look around and go, okay, I'm glad I have these team members on my right and my left because we're going to need each other to succeed.
And what happens from a sports lens? I'm sure you've been in some sports rooms and team environments. What happens in the sports world when we have a psychological safe environment? Like, what have you seen visually, and maybe what do you hear? What's kind of the result when you got this thing down?
I think the result is less ego and more teamwork, and more appreciation and even joy around the idea that you've got my back, I've got yours. we're in it together. We're in it to win it, but we're all sort of working together. And that's even true in the more solo sports, where, like gymnastics or tennis, where people on your team are individual competitors in the limelight when it happens, and behind the scenes, we're giving each other really good feedback. We're supporting each other. We're helping people recover from disappointments. So there's this just wonderful notion of we, and we are stronger and better than I.
Is there a speed component with this all? I could imagine that, the longer I know somebody, the more I trust them, the more I'm willing to open up. And sometimes for per se a high school or college coach, I only have you on my team for a maximum of 4 years. And
Yes,
especially now in college, you see people transferring even more. Can we hurry up the process of
yes,
psychological safety?
yes, yes. I mean, psychological safety isn't okay. It absolutely isn't the default. It isn't natural or spontaneous. But it isn't something that has to be built over a long period of time. It can be built very quickly. As soon as I take an interpersonal risk, right? I show some vulnerability, and that gets a positive response. Oh, good. I mean, I took a risk, and that risk was rewarded because I didn't get rejected, humiliated, kicked out of the tribe. Instead, I got a kind of, oh, I've been there. I've felt that too. And so then not only I suddenly realized, yeah, this is a place, this is a container where I can take a risk, but you observing me in that interaction also realize, like the vicarious learning is quite real and quite important. So I think psychological safety, people say it takes time to build, can be shot, killed in an instant. That's true. And it doesn't have to take time. And where it takes less time is when we're explicit about it. When we say, let's talk about the kind of environment we want to build and why it matters, and then let's work together to build it.
Mm. Like most things, I think I see it almost the imagery of like daily deposits. And every day we
Yes.
put in a daily deposit towards a psychological safe environment. What I'm most interested to know is what are some of the strategies the coach is leaning in? Okay, I love this. I want to have a psychological safe environment. I get that it's every single day. I know the importance of it and the results that can come. Amy, how do I do it? Give me some
Yeah.
strategies.
Well, I'd say number one, and this might seem surprising, but double down on emphasizing the goal, right? They double down on getting people on the same page on why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish. And because it reminds us, it puts it back into the front of mind of sort of why it's worth stretching and straining and taking risks because of what's at stake, because of what we want to do together. And then secondly, sort of go out of your way to invite input, to ask good questions, to curate conversations, to sort of make sure that we are taking the risks we need to take and having the conversations we need to have to achieve those ambitious goals we're trying to achieve. And then finally, respond, be very thoughtful about how you respond to someone taking a risk, to something going wrong, to a failure, to a disappointment. And by thoughtful, I mean treat each and every one of those events as learning moments. And I don't mean that in a sort of trite way, like, oh yeah, this is a learning experience, right? But I mean, truly, there are data there that we can learn from, right? If we had a disappointing result in in a sports event, okay, that's we look at the videotape. We've tried to figure out what happened, what went wrong and why. We stay away from who did it, who to blame, and we take a look at the what. What happened? What do we learn? What does it mean for next time? So a productive response is always forward facing. I mean, we use the data of the past to learn, but we're using it for the future, right? Not to kind of allocate blame and, accountability and so forth.
Very cool. I love these three. Let's double down on them. So the first one is doubling down on emphasizing the goal. And so oftentimes I think coaches maybe even skip the step completely and we just
Yep.
go right into
It's a given.
practicing. We go right into games. Hey, we're here to, well, maybe that's not the goal, or maybe your goal is different than my goal. So I think a first step is maybe obvious to you and I, but to some coaches, we get into it and we kind of forget, oh, do the student athletes know the goal? Are we all
Right.
clear? The best coaches are extremely clear about standards, expectations, goals.
Exactly.
So number one is
Sorry.
emphasizing the goal and having clarity. Go ahead.
Yes, no, I just was so excited by what you were saying because it might seem like the goal is obvious. I mean, I think the good coaches, the good leaders know that no, the goal isn't obvious for two reasons. One, it just falls to the back of mind. And two, the obvious goal is we want to win, but that's not the real goal. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. But the real goal is we want to show up, do our very best, give it all we have, use the strategies and tactics that we've been practicing, and accept the outcome. The goal is continuously getting better, stronger, and positioning ourselves to be more able to win.
The second piece of strategy was invite input and ask good questions. I love learning some of the best questions. I think that's why I'm a podcaster. I love
Yeah,
asking
that's
questions, Amy.
right.
Tell me, what are some of your favorite go-to questions for coaches and leaders to create a psychological safe environment?
Well, in general, any what question is gonna you're in the right domain, and how is a secondary good question strategy. But here's one of my favorite go-to questions is who has a different view? Now I know that wasn't what, but you can see why, right? Who has a different view? And what I often hear, and this is most often in the management sort of setting, is someone after a discussion of an important and uncertain issue will say, does anyone have a different view? Now, first of all, that's a yes, no question. And second, I think you can appreciate that that puts the threshold very high. It's essentially saying, does any one of you have the courage to slow us down?
Right.
Forget it, right? Nope, nobody wants to sort of at the end, okay, yeah, I have a different view at this point. But if you're serious and you really want to make sure you're not about to commit a preventable failure in some kind. And you say, who has a different view? That puts the threshold quite low. That essentially says one of you has a treasure, I don't know which one.
I had David Burkus on my show who said he's familiar with your work as well. One of the key things, key question, kind of a subtle shift was instead of saying, what questions do you have? And you kind of
Right.
point the finger at them. You actually flip it and say, what did I miss? And just that simple, what do you
That's
have
right.
versus what did I miss? It creates a little bit of a shift and some
Yeah,
accountability and some more
right.
invitation to speak up. I think that's just a subtle one word, but that can make a big difference.
It's really true. So what we're talking about really is taking that extra second to reflect on the question you're about to ask and ask yourself, what does that question do, imply? What would it, if I were asked that question, how might I feel and how might I respond? And if you can get yourself, I think, this might sound very technical, but I think the bypass, the quick way to do this is just get yourself into a place of genuine curiosity. Right? If you can force yourself to remember, oh, I don't know. I don't see reality. I see a partial reality. I don't have an omniscient point of view. I have my point of view, and therefore I am genuinely curious and eager to get your view. And so then I'm just gonna spontaneously ask the kinds of questions I'll need to ask to make sure it's sort of safe and motivating for people to offer their perspectives.
Amy, I'm smiling so big because you just said my favorite word. If you can see back here, it says "Stay
Oh yeah,
curious."
there it is.
All of the shirts that I sell, they say "Stay curious" on the back. I don't have a tattoo, but if I had a
Yeah.
tattoo, it would say "Stay curious." I believe curiosity is a superpower. It's the first chapter of my book. I think I'm so big on that. Why don't you just tell me a little bit more? Kind of stroke my ego a little bit. Why is
Yeah.
curiosity so
Oh,
important from your angle when working with coaches and managers?
I think if I had only, if there was only one value or attribute to emphasize, it would be curiosity, truly. And that's because we're living and working in a changing world. So we have to force ourselves to stay curious. But let's put it like this. It is hard to learn if you already know, right? Knowing is a state that shuts down curiosity. And, we all spontaneously have that experience of knowing. I have my expertise. I look around and it sure looks like I'm seeing the full reality. I'm unaware of sort of my gaps. And so that's the human condition. And it's hard to learn if you already know. And we have that natural, spontaneous experience of knowing. So we have to override it. We have to override it because we know we need to learn. We need and maybe at times even want to learn. So the way to override it is to force yourself into a state of curiosity.
Oh, I love it so much. The third strategy was respond with thoughtfulness and treat it as a learning moment. Amy, what does that sound like? If a
Yeah,
coach is thinking, "Ooh, I like that," what does it sound like? What are some phrases?
yeah.
What would they do? What would they say?
So, so what it would sound like, one of my favorite phrases would be, "Thank you for that clear line of sight." Right? If someone brings bad news or brings a report that they have an injury or they're not up to, they just don't feel ready or able, right? Thank you, right? Like thank you for your truthfulness. Thank you for giving me the more information I need and want, right? And so it's a kind of, so that's a, you can say it in a variety of ways, but it's an appreciative stance, right? So it's like, ooh, that's interesting. That's good to know at this point. And it's not a knee jerk, how the heck did that happen? Right? It's a wow, okay, that's useful data. Right? So all there's a variety of things that just appreciate that, yes, that's useful data. And so appreciative and forward looking. And forward looking means we force ourselves to be more interested in the future than the past. We're naturally students of the past, right? We're just thinking about that stupid thing I just did or that disappointment I just had, and it can take you over. But if I can force myself to say now is time zero, and the only time I have any influence over is time one and two and three and on it goes. So a productive response, a thoughtful response is one that is appreciative and forward looking. Like, where do we go from here? What ideas do you have? Other good phrase. What might we try next?
I love the phrase, "and what else?" I think it's
Yeah,
important to the coach may be talking and going through some things. This is what we need to work on. This is what I'm seeing. And then pause for a second and the words, "and what else?" Because there's always something more. But being able to say, "and what else?" and then sit back and listen, I think those are powerful words too.
huge, hugely.
A couple more strategies that I've found to be successful in the environments I've been around is this idea of coaches speaking last. So the head
Mm.
coach or the leader might give an opportunity for his assistants to speak, hopefully for the student athletes to speak, and then the leader or the coach, they speak last. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in under conditions where we're trying to say make a difficult decision or decide on a path forward, if the highest ranking person speaks first, there's no getting around the fact that that will either subtly or powerfully influence what others think or say. And so if you want cleaner data, you go last. I do think it's helpful to be explicit about the why, right? Because the only worry, the only downside of going last is that it can make people nervous. It's like we know the coach is going last, and we're going to sit around and be thinking, I wonder what they think, and sort of get we could get all caught up in this guessing game. So you want to use this strategy, but you want to use it explicitly, openly. So I truly need and want to hear what all of you are thinking about this issue. And so I am going to deliberately hold back on my thoughts to get a better sense of what you know. By the way, you may be closer to the field than I am. And then I'll tell you what I was thinking coming in, but I'll also share how I'm thinking now. Right. So again, the more explicit you can be about the process step you're using, I think the better off you are.
I love it. Help me with this scenario here. I think there's some coaches out there that, they're wanting to promote psychological safety. They want the environment where members feel safe for taking risk and permission to be candid. They even model it themselves, which I'm sure is probably the number one strategy. But yet, still, nobody's coming in their office.
Yeah.
Nobody is sharing. It's just not happening. What should they do?
Make it a team problem-solving opportunity. Right?
Okay.
So in other words, that's a puzzle and bring the puzzle to the team. Share the observation just as you just did and say, I'd love your help. Like I'm genuinely committed. I think it will help us. And I'm sure there are things I'm doing that are making it hard. Love to hear more about them. I'm sure there are other things that are going on that make it hard. So don't try to solve it yourself behind closed doors and then bring some beautiful solution forward to the team. Invite them into the dilemma.
Could this come through anonymous survey or something like that? If it's like, hey, I'm really scared to speak up, is this
Yeah,
something
I mean,
that you would
it
recommend?
could, right? Anonymous surveys are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they've got this very powerful blade that allows people to share their thoughts, knowing that it's anonymous. On the other hand, it's subtly sending a signal that, yeah, like speaking up honestly as you is scary. So we won't do that. So, but sometimes that's a useful sword to bring to bear, again, explicitly, and then, try to declare the dilemma in a way that you're inviting those others. I mean, high school is different perhaps, but most of the time we're actually dealing with adults, right? Let's treat them like adults. Let's get their input, get their help, um, and talk about mindset. I think of this as a sort of joint problem solving mindset, right? The mindset that our problems are shared and our solutions will be co-produced.
What I see is maybe the biggest issue when it comes to within like a coaching staff talking about adults is when the power dynamic comes to
Yeah,
play. So for
yeah,
instance, on a football team, like a offensive coordinator has more responsibilities than the running back coach per se. And because they have more
yeah.
responsibility and perhaps a bigger paycheck, because of that, there's a power dynamic struggle when it comes to psychological safety within the coaching environment. How do you work with, what are your thoughts on the
Yeah.
power dynamic and how do you work through that? That's a loaded question, isn't it?
Yes. Well, a lot of my early research and later research was done in hospitals. There's a power dynamic in
Absolutely.
hospitals, right? There's a hierarchy. So what I ultimately have come to believe is that hierarchy and power present a risk factor, but they don't have to be deterministic of the culture. Right? You can have a psychologically safe culture in a highly hierarchical environment. So what that means is, like the Toyota production system, for instance, what that means is you go out of your way, especially as leaders, to create an environment where everybody knows they can and should pull the and-on cord when they see a problem, when they're not sure about something. So it's the bottom line is this. Hierarchy is a risk factor, but it's not deterministic. It is how hierarchy is handled that shapes the climate. So how should it be handled? And now we go back to, with curiosity, with humility, with genuine recognition that you have a responsibility and a role to play. A lot of the responsibility is on your shoulders. That's just the way it is. And you can't do it alone. Right? So you're coming at it with curiosity, with humility, with determination, and a clear-eyed recognition that, like it or not, you're dependent on others for the win. Right? So when surgeons, when medical directors, when coaches show up with that mindset, they are both conveying, yes, I understand the role I'm in, and I understand that I need you.
I'm sure you've run into this at some point. What does it look like when the leader has no idea that their environment is not psychologically safe? I'm thinking again of a football staff, perhaps. The head coach has no idea, but all the assistant coaches are like, if he only knew how
Right.
unsafe this environment is. What's the advice to perhaps the assistant coaches to bring that to the head coach of, hey, look, this is an unsafe environment? What does that conversation look like?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And by the way, what it looks like is, the sort of traffic light metaphor where green is the good news, and red is bad. And, it looks like an awful lot of green, right? So if you in sports or out, if you're hearing nothing but green, you're not hearing the whole story, right? Because there's just no world in which everything's green. And so the conversation looks essentially like this. It's sort of three steps. It's I or we see a problem. We may be wrong. Love to get your thoughts about it. And what can we try? Right. So it's not you're not coming clear-eyed with here's how you fix it, but here's what we see, right? Or here's what I see. And again, always I may be wrong. I have a partial point of view. I have I can only say what I see, and I need your thoughts, right? So as long as if you approach someone with you're the problem, either in the back of your mind or coming out of your mouth, it won't work, right? Because nobody believes they're the problem. So you have to sort of say, here's the concern I have. Here's the question I have. Here's the observation I have. Again, I may be missing something. Would love to have your thoughts, but the be clear about what you believe we're missing. Like where are we not getting the full value of our organization because of certain behaviors? Or just not, it's not you. You're not a bad person, but there are certain ways you show up that are silencing dissenting views, for example. Again, I keep going back to a sort of more business environment where these things can be really expensive. I mean, it can you can really make bad decisions if you've inadvertently created a climate where your other experts can't speak up.
And that can be such a difficult conversation, can't it? With a
Oh
leader who
yeah.
is completely unaware, or maybe
Yep.
they full on disagree. No, I don't
Right.
think this is
I,
this is what you say it is. That can be a tough time, can't it?
it can. And if I inadvertently promised this would all be easy, I apologize. Right? This is hard stuff, right? Winning a championship is hard stuff, right? Being a successful business is hard stuff. None of it is easy, or else everybody do it.
Other than a coach just straight up asking their team if they feel like this is a psychological safe environment, what are some signs and symptoms of a high psychological safe environment and a low? If a coach is just trying to think, maybe they're in the off season right now, they're not with their student athletes, but they're thinking to themselves, they're driving right now, like, I wonder what my environment's like. What are some signs and symptoms of both sides?
Well, I mean, you can always do a survey, but that's sort of, let's put that aside. I think it's really more about pausing to reflect on what's the mix. What's the mix of safe things versus, riskier or more honest or more vulnerable things that you're hearing? How are the conversations unfolding, right? How sanitized do they seem? If you really pause to remind yourself that we're operating in a complex, uncertain, ambiguous world, and how, you know, if you start sort of reflecting on the conversation, how much risk did it take for someone to say that or say that? And if your answer is not much, then you probably have room for improvement. And if you have a very highly sort of psychologically safe environment, you should be there's going to be more energy, and there's going to be more disagreement, and hopefully more, more learning, more sort of, I didn't think about it that way. Right? How often do you hear that phrase? Oh, that's interesting. How would that work in action, right? So that people start to get truly engaged by each other's contributions, and then you suddenly start feeling like we're making progress. We're going somewhere.
What role does gender play in the leader when it comes to psychological safety? Male coach or female coach? What is your research seeing? What have you seen?
I don't have any data on that, any systematic data.
Mhm.
I think that what we're really talking about are leadership behaviors that create a learning mindset, learning environment, that can be practiced by anyone.
Sometimes I think about when I think about the female teams that I've worked with, generally speaking, more female teams, there's kind of this task relationships kind of dichotomy. Females are
Yeah.
a little bit more driven by relationships, men are a little bit more driven by
Yep.
task. Men could hate each other, but on the field, it's like, hey, we're going to war, we're going to do our
Yep.
thing. Women, if we hate each other off the field, I'm gonna have a really hard time competing with you on the field.
Yeah.
So that's what I was kind of interested in
Yeah.
is there,
It may be
a
true,
difference? Yeah.
but I don't have, for one thing I can say just, not scientifically, but observationally, is that women are socialized differently than men in our society. So we are socialized to care about relationships very much, right? There's almost a deep sense that your life depends upon it, right? If people reject you, don't like you, you'll die, right? And I think more so, I think that's true for all humans, but there will be a gap in that internal belief, and so the relationship. So that's both a blessing and a curse, because actually we live in a relational world where relationships do matter, relationships do drive success, relationships drive openness and high quality conversations, but it can become a curse when we're tiptoeing as a result. I so much don't want you to not like me that I'm not going to tell you the truth. Then that's a sort of superficial notion of relating, of genuine high quality relationship versus kind of superficial relationship.
All right. Interesting one here for you, Amy. What's the how can a coach identify the difference between low psychological safety and lack of effort? Low psychological safety and lack of
Yeah,
effort.
it's a great question because truly they are two different dimensions,
Okay.
right? You can think about it. You can have high psychological safety, low effort. You can have low psychological safety, high effort. What you want, of course, is both, right? You want high psychological safety, high effort. I think your strategies as a coach, well, first of all, how do you know where you are? Well, think about those four domains, right? Low, low. That's just apathy, right? You can see it. People are just kind of they quit and stay. Their heart's not in it. They don't seem to like each other very much. There's a kind of almost antisocial, anti-trying, which we got to get out of, right, quickly. And, I think high psychological safety, low effort, it's like a really warm and, high relationship quality kind of place, but we're not working very hard. We're not pushing each other. We're not doing our practices with all the gusto we could. And um, I worry more, I think, and I think this is very applicable to the athletic realm, to the sort of high effort but low psychological safety, because this will lead people to not be willing to admit when they're in trouble. And then that puts everybody at risk, or not be willing to ask for help or ask for feedback or give feedback because there's this interpersonally fraught sense. So we're working really hard because I care. I really want to win. I care about the result, but we're at risk in a way. We're at risk of failures that we didn't see coming because of that. So where both are high, where effort and psychological safety are high, we're in the winning zone. I mean, I think we're in the best place we can be. So effort, how do you motivate effort? You probably know a great deal more about that than I do. I would say we keep reminding people and getting people sort of enthusiastic about the goal, where we're going, why it means so much to us, get us all on that same page. We also give people feedback and strategies for becoming excellent. And the psychological safety is what we've been talking about before. Just keep encouraging and enabling high quality learning, orientation, risk taking so that we can be good in a changing world.
I'd be curious to know, you've been researching this subject for a long time. What's something you've changed your mind on when it comes to psychological safety?
I think early on I saw it as a driver of learning and performance, and then I realized over time and with additional research that wasn't quite right. It's not a dri- it's a, There's nothing about psychological. It's sort of the effort psychological safety conversation we were just having. There's nothing about psychological safety that will motivate effort. Um, it is an enabler. Right? So from a statistical perspective, it's a moderating variable, not a driving variable, not
Yeah,
a
say
not
say
a
more about that. Yeah, say more about that.
so not a causal variable. So think about it this way: you're driving a car. Psychological safety is not the fuel. It's not the electricity or the gas in the tank that allows the car to get momentum and go forward. What it is taking your foot off the brake. Right? Psychological safety in a team is taking everybody's foot off the brake so that we're not holding ourselves back due to interpersonal fear. We're letting ourselves take interpersonal risks in pursuit of the ultimate goal. Um, and so from a research point of view, once I started thinking of this as a moderator, not a driver, not a causal variable. It's not a variable that causes high performance. It's a variable that allows high performance. What causes high performance? Well, individual skills, good strategy, lots of practice, whatever, you tell me. And then psychological safety just sort of takes the brakes off.
Very cool. It's almost like it's not necessary to have, but it's nice to have.
Well, or it's not, it will never be sufficient,
Sufficient.
right? It will, because it's just not enough. You need other factors that motivate effort and excellence.
To me, Amy, I've been reading your stuff. I've been really diving into psychological safety, and from my point of view, it seems obvious. And I don't mean to minimize any of
Yeah,
your
no, no,
work by
no.
any means. That's not what I'm trying to do. I think it's
Right.
very, very important, but to me, it's very obvious and it's very
Yeah.
natural for me because I'm a very natural, curious individual. I like people's input. So to me, it's a very like, yeah, it's kind of like, duh.
Yeah.
Why or what is the biggest struggle with this when it comes to coaching environments in the sports world? Why is it difficult for some? I don't know.
Well, two things. One, human nature, and two, overlearned counterproductive mental models. And the overlearned, so human nature is, we want to look good, not bad. We care what people think of us. We're cognitively a little bit lazy. So we sort of size up a situation, think we understand it. Because I mean, I think you're right. It's what we're talking about is on one level quite obvious intellectually, but behaviorally and in action we just show up and we've overlearned all sorts of habits that are, in a sense, anti-learning, that get
That's
in the
right.
way of learning. So learning is natural and learning is blocked. And the taken for granted mental models that get in the way. I mean, I think there's overlearned, probably especially among coaches, overlearned beliefs like you gotta, if you scare them enough, they'll work really hard. A better way, that's not quite right. A better way to say is if you scare them enough, they will present the appearance of working really hard.
Yeah.
Like if you scare them enough, the one thing I can guarantee is you will not know what's really going on in people's heads behind closed doors, right? So what you actually want, if you want true access to reality, to what's really happening, you have got to be approachable. You've got to be passionate about where we're going and why it matters, but also absolutely approachable, learning oriented, curious, you know, to humble. I don't mean humble like false modesty. I mean humble like none of us has a crystal ball. None of us has omnipotence, the power to produce whatever result we want. We can only do our very best to produce the results we all want together.
Let's talk about failure. You have a phenomenal book. You guys listening, this book is great. It's called The Right Kind of Wrong: The Science of Failing Well. So let's, as we're kind of going through this, maybe it's chronological per se. We have a safe environment, things are going well, but how do we actually use failure to move forward instead of being paralyzed by it? Can we dive
Yeah.
into some of the book material? This is great.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think sports is like the best context in which to talk about this because every athlete, every serious athlete understands the right kind of wrong already. Everybody knows, there's never been an athlete in the history of humanity that won every match, right? And so much better than the rest of us that failure is part of the journey, right? And doesn't make them any more fun, right? We all are disappointed by losing, not winning. We're all disappointed by failures, but we understand, and you understand that failure is a stepping stone on the journey toward the ultimate goal. And so right kind of wrong really refers to, I identify three types of failure. And the right kind of wrong are those that I call intelligent failures. And they are the undesired result of thoughtful forays into new territory. Now, every every match, every game is new territory, kind of by definition. And if you show up and do your best, use the strategies you've practiced, the skills you've practiced, and you're confronted with a loss, that's the right kind of wrong, right? There was no more you could have done. You didn't leave anything, on the field or on the court. So that is the quintessential right kind of wrong. And it probably, your audience knows this already, but I always like to point out that the most elite athletes, scientists, you name it, are not people who fail less often than the average person. They're literally people who fail more often. That's of course because they have a bigger denominator, right? They're just out there more. And if you're out there more, you're failing more. So Roger Federer's sort of famous line about I lost 50, I mean I lost, what was it, 49% or something of the games I played or the points I played. And, that's a lot of failure, right? But that's a lot of points. And we all know, and anybody who, it's easy to say that as a world champion, but that's the mindset that everybody needs to embrace. The other two kinds of failure A basic failure is a failure with a single simple cause, usually human error, right? We knew what we wanted to do, but made a mistake, didn't do it, led to a failure. Truly, we can do better, and we use that failure to learn and say, okay, how do we prevent that? We don't want to repeat. We'll all make mistakes, but we don't want to repeat the same mistake a second time. And then third, complex failures are those that are multi-causal. I mean, it's the weather, the flight was late, the time, a whole bunch of things conspire to put us not at our best, and we were unable to win. Disappointing as can be, and we can learn from, figure out how maybe we take an earlier flight, whatever, right? You find the possible ways in which you could have prevented, and you do better next time. But you cannot waste excessive time beating yourself up for the perfect storm that just happened to happen and derail your plans.
What a great explanation. I love this imagery of fail like a scientist, I say to the kids I work
Yes.
with. And what I
Yeah.
mean by that, it's a little playful, tongue in cheek, but this idea is that scientists, they don't see failure because everything is just data. So they get
Yeah.
through an experiment and maybe the
Exactly.
hypothesis doesn't come true, but it goes, hey, I have data and I can move that data to the next experiment. And
Right.
that thought process, especially with young student athletes, it's like, oh, okay, I can use this
Yeah.
and move forward. There's no such thing as failure. So I say, fail like a scientist.
Yeah, and scientists are human too. So they are disappointed. I assure you, I'm married to one, right? They are disappointed when the data don't behave, right? They're disappointed when they have a failure, but they have trained themselves to understand that that failure is great data on the path toward a major discovery, right? So they've trained themselves to cope with the disappointment, face forward, and keep on going. And never make the mistake of don't use those data to learn, right? You don't just say, okay, it failed, I'm going to move on. It's like, it failed. I wonder why. What happened? What does it teach me? Now that I'm smarter, my next experiment will be better. And on it goes, all the way up to, that brilliant discovery.
One of the series that I'm doing in this podcast is called Coaching Beyond the Scoreboard. It's the name of my keynote as well, and just getting coaches and athletes to think beyond just the numbers on the scoreboard. But so often in competitive sports, the scoreboard overrides the
Yeah,
learning process. I'd be curious to hear how could
yeah.
coaches reframe losing on the scoreboard in a way that encourages reflection instead of shame?
The scoreboard is data, right? The scoreboard is nothing more, nothing less than data. I mean, yes, we would all rather be up than down, win, not fail, but you have to train people to see those as the way we hold ourselves honest. We use those data to learn and grow and improve. That's all they are. Because the problem is if you fall in love with yourself when you win, then you're at risk for not continuing to learn. And if you beat yourself up excessively when you lose, then you're at risk for not continuing to grow and learn, right? So you've got to train yourself, whether it's a win or a loss, it's either way, it's just data, right? And the loses are beeps going forward, right? They're again disappointments, but not, I mean, they're part of the journey. We've already reminded ourselves that, and we remind ourselves of that.
What would your advice be to a coach out there who to handle a situation when, there's a lot of things that happen in a game per se, and it depends what sport we're talking about. But what happens if I'm thinking like a basketball game, last second shot, and the kid misses it? I mean,
Yeah,
clearly there's a lot of things that
yeah.
come up to that point, but you had a chance to either win the game or lose the game based on this, and it cost your team the game per se. What would be a way for a coach to use that as a supportive growth moment
Yeah.
versus instilling more fear?
Well, first of all, it wouldn't it be nice, although it would be a very boring game, if we all had perfect control over where that ball went in those
That's right.
last seconds when we, throw it for a three-pointer, right? We don't, right? That's it. So you have to, even to push back on your question, you have to reframe it, right? It is you had that moment where there was an opportunity, however slim, to change the outcome, and disappointingly, it didn't happen, right? Again, it's a beep going forward. It's too bad. But had it gone the other way, more did that. I mean, more won that game. That they all won the game with every move they made all the way up until that point, including the person who passed the ball to you. So it's the hero bum syndrome, and it's a problematic syndrome. Like you're a hero if you made it, you're a bum if you didn't. Neither is true. If you made it, great, we did it, right? And wow, that was lucky, right? That we had that moment and that ball sailed over and went in, fantastic, right? Gave it all we had and it didn't. Disappointing. Either way, we're facing forward, right? So you have to be willing not to kind of overpraise the hero who isn't really a hero, just a team member, and then therefore you won't be blaming the bum for not making it. I mean,
I think
what are
that's
the stats better than I. Whatever the
mhm.
stats are, you know, we had a one in whatever chance of changing the outcome, but doesn't change the fact that going into that moment, we weren't ahead.
That's right. Great point. I think too, the dangerous slope that athletes could go down is they experience a quote unquote failure. I don't even like the word failure, that's why I'm putting in quotes, but they're
Yeah,
experiencing
right.
failure, and then because of that, they attach their identity, Amy, to I
Yeah,
am a failure. That's when it
right,
gets
right,
dangerous,
right.
when you attach your identity to it. How does a coach get
Absolutely.
in the way of making sure it's not attaching their identity to it?
That's a beautiful question because it's really, you must disrupt that link.
Right.
That link is quite natural, spontaneous for us as humans, and it's disruptible, right? So, and you disrupt it explicitly. And it's be very thoughtful about your language, right? That was the shot failed. That does not make us or you a failure, right? We played a great game. We used the skills we've been practicing. We needed a little more juice at the end, or whatever the observation you have. Be useful as a coach. That's your job, right? Point out the places where we could have done something differently. Point out the places where you could have done something differently, uh, and never lose sight of the forward-facing perspective mindset.
I'd love to hear. Do you have an example or a story, either it's from business or sports, where you saw a leader or a coach use failure as a way to strengthen their team culture, and rather than break it down, do you have a story or an example where that came out to
Oh,
be?
I, so many. I guess I do have a story. The first story that came to mind is a story in a hospital setting, and that was where a patient um, accidentally, obviously, you'd never do this on purpose, received a massive overdose of morphine. Fortunately, that failure, and that is a bad and potentially catastrophic failure, was caught, after. I mean, it would have been better to catch it before the patient received the drug, but it was caught and the patient was ended up fine. But it could have been much worse. So even though it was caught and corrected, an antidote essentially administered, um, that's a very close call. So then immediately, meaning like the next day, a team is convened of everyone who touched that event, meaning the pharmacist who filled the vial, the IT person who made the confusing label, the bedside nurse who administered it, the surgeon who sent the patient to the wrong unit in the first, and that's just, it doesn't take long, but they dug in and they answered the question, what happened from their perspective. And by the time that meeting is over, everybody sees the whole story more fully and understands the vulnerabilities that frankly exist at the handoffs, right? Even when people, I'm not saying they did, but even when people do their own job as well as possible, or at least well, there are vulnerabilities at the handoffs. And once we learn and better understand where those vulnerabilities are, then we can bolster them, reduce them. So this is the kind of earnest, you know, um, learning from failure moment where the consequences are really high, and our main interest, of course, is in the future. In how do we prevent anything like this from ever happening again?
So the obvious strategy for me is let's bring it to light rather than, hey, we lose a game on a
Yes,
Friday night, let's not talk about it. It's let's
right.
break this thing down.
That's so important because the natural response is just move on. Think that we dodged that bullet. Now let's move on. Or we whisper in the hallways with one friend or colleague. But no, we bring it out. We put the sunshine on it. The best disinfectant is sunshine, right? We shine light on it to find out the scientific, earnest answer to the question, what happened? Not who did it, what's to blame, what's that, but what happened? And then the vulnerabilities become clear. It's like the old blind man and the elephant, right? Where blind men, where, well, it seems like a tree trunk, it seems like a rope. Well, they're all right, but they're all woefully incomplete in their description of the elephant. And then once we hear from everybody, now we know what an elephant looks like.
Perfect. So bring it to light, switch your perspective. If there's a third component for coaches to walk away from today to create
Yeah.
a more failure intelligent environment, what would be your third and final strategy?
It's listen intently, right? So it's, what do we set out to do? What actually happened? What's the difference and why? Where do we go from here?
I love it. This has been so much fun. I want to close down with just one call to action. If a coach out there is listening and they say, I want a more psychological, safe environment, I should do what?
I would say ask better questions, right? If there's only one thing I can say, it's train yourself to stay or become deeply curious and let that drive you to ask high quality questions of your team.
And if I'm a coach and I want to create an environment that my athletes and my staff see failure as feedback and we could start failing the right way, I should.
Tell stories of where that worked really well in action.
Cool.
Like
Amy, this
stories are memorable and stories show us how it really works and why.
and you have a fantastic story in the opening of this book. I was drawn in. By the way, like I said, this book is great. Right Kind of Wrong. We just got into a little bit of it. This book is packed with great stuff. Highly recommend it. Amy, how can my listeners best support you?
Well, I read the book. I mean, I love I would be lying if I said I love writing. Writing is hard work. Writing is learning oriented, failure prone work. But by the time I'm done, I think it's pretty readable, and I think it can change mindsets and maybe even lives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. You're so brilliant. I really appreciate you breaking down this topic and educating me and my coaches and parents listening. Everybody can create a better environment. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's great being with you.